On this lecture, we will discuss about fundamentals of nervous system. So this is one of our slides from endocrine system. Like there are two main control systems in our body. They are nervous system and the endocrine system. As we all know, endocrine system influence the body activity, especially metabolic activity, by means of hormones. And these hormones will act on the target cells. Nervous system, its influence and conduct its activity via the electrochemical impulses, which are delivered by neurons. These organs will respond within a millisecond, so very quick, very fast. So we are going to talk about nervous system today. When we talk about the functions of the nervous system, I want you to have a look and think. So what we see every day, what we hear every day, like when we touch something, all these perception comes into our brain, and that is called the sensory input. And that information will be integrated in our brain, some part of the brain or the spinal cord, and will be respond via the appropriate motor output. So we see something, we hear something, we try to interpret and integrate in our central nervous system, and then with appropriate response, the motor output will come out from the central nervous system, and we will react to the stimuli we get. So it is in our nervous system, we have something different, like therefore we call it special senses. Special senses mean senses that have specialized organs devoted to them. For example, like taste came from the chemical stimuli, chemical sense. Smell came from chemical stimuli, chemical sense. Vision, of course, we got vision from electromagnetic spectrum rays. And hearing, equilibrium, so sound, wavelength. These are the special senses. And touch, like the feeling of being touched or you are touching something, it is not a special sense. So we will have to discuss these special senses as a different lecture, but we are now going to talk generally about the nervous system. So how do we classify nervous system? The easiest way to classify is like central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system means brain and spinal cord. So anything other than brain and spinal cord is under the peripheral nervous system. So if you look at here, this is our brain inside our cranium and the spinal cord in the spinal canal, which is color-coded with brown. This is under the central nervous system, and anything come out from the central nervous system, they are in peripheral nervous system. So those nerves directly coming out from the brain, that will be regarded as peripheral nervous system. And spinal nerve coming out from the spinal cord, they are in the peripheral nervous system. So now we have classified the nervous system into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, we will further divide into sensory component, sensory division, and motor division. So as you see from the previous slide, any input into the brain, into our body, any sensory information, that could be either from the somatic, which is the body, or visceral, like internal visceral organs. All these sensation, all these information will be carried via the peripheral nervous system, and they will go to the central nervous system. And there will be integration and formation of process in the central nervous system, and appropriate motor response will come back out via the peripheral nervous system and go and act as motor or efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. So now we have central, sensory or efferent input and the motor or efferent input, output. Division. Now under the motor, we still have the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system means, again, these are the nervous system, motor component, motor division, but it supplies the visceral organ. And therefore, we can also call visceral motor system. So to make it short, in either sensory or motor division, we have somatic and visceral. And here in the motor as well, we have somatic and visceral division. So now let's enter the autonomic nervous system here, which is for the motor, for the visceral organs, further divided into sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. Sympathetic division and parasympathetic division, they are very different. They are usually opposite, but they work closely to get the body homeostasis. So now let's look at a bit more carefully. The nervous system structurally can be divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system include brain and spinal cord, and anything coming out from the brain and spinal cord is regarded as peripheral nervous system. Functionally, peripheral nervous system can be divided into sensory component and motor component. Sensory component, all these sensory input can be coming from the somatic, means soma, body, so skin and bones and joint, and visceral organs, visceral sensory fibers will be coming from the visceral organs, for example, like stomach, intestine. They will all come into the spinal cord via the peripheral nervous system, and they will go to the brain for integration and control center, and all the control output, which is motor, efferent, will come out along the brain and spinal cord and will be connected to the appropriate organ via the motor division, which include somatic and visceral motor. And visceral motor is called autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So this is the New York City power lines in 1887. If you look at that, all these cables are running and mix and match, and it is so complex. The same thing like in our nervous system, all the nerve fibers, like either sensory or motor or might be both. And they will be efferent fibers, sympathetic, visceral, all fibers are mix and mesh. So now A good way to try to understand this is like just divide it into 4 components. The first, sensory; second, motor; and under the sensory component, it could be somatic or visceral. Under the motor, it could be somatic or visceral. I hope you have been looking at this page for a while. What I want you to see is the relationship of the three functional regions of a neuron. And now here we can see in the blue area, we have our cell body and the dendrites. Their job is to receive the stimuli from the surrounding structures, surrounding areas. These stimuli from the surrounding environment will be picked up by the dendrites, and then that will be taken to the cell body. And cell body will biosynthetic center and start stimulating the electrical impulse, which will be carried along the axon, which is the conducting region, which is colored with green. And finally, at the end of the axon, which will be the neurotransmitters, will be released from the axon terminals, which are called terminal butons. So it might look slightly different in the bipolar neuron and might be in the unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neuron. This is just for information, like many different types of neurons we have in our body. Like multipolar neurons could be this shape or either this shape, and so on and on and on. I want you to take your time, have a look at these. So multipolar neurons, as you can see here, they are motor neurons. We have been talking about this spinal cord structure every time we get a chance. This is the cross-section of the spinal cord. And now we can see the H-shaped gray, darker brown color structure and lighter brown periphery. This is what we call the gray matter, where the neurons accumulate. And now at the anterior end of the H shape, we call it anterior horn, and we have the motor neuron starting from there. It comes out from the front anterior. It doesn't come out from the posterior. It comes out from the anterior, and it travels as the motor neuron and go and supply the mast cell. So the neuron we know, which is multipolar neurons, are motor neurons. Bipolar neurons, where do we see? Like we have it in our eyes, like at the end, retina, we have the bipolar neurons, which carry impulses to the brain. And unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neurons, which are rare, they are present in the peripheral nervous system, where the dendrites carry the sensation. And now here we have cell body, and then in the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion, and now it travels again into the spinal cord as sensory. It is entering from the posterior horn, and the motor neuron is leaving from the anterior horn. So according to the function, we will classify neurons into sensory neuron, which carries the sensory information to the central nervous system, or afferent neuron, motor neuron, which carries motor impulse from the central nervous system to the target organ, or it is also called efferent neuron. An interneuron, which is just confined to the central nervous system, which might be communicating and connecting from sensory to motor. Let's talk about supporting cells for the nervous system. Of course, neuron is the functional unit, and neurons need supporting cells, which are called neuroglia cells. Like we have like astrocytes, microglia cells, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system, and we also had satellite cells, which surround the neuron in the cell body, in the ganglia, and therefore it will be in the peripheral nervous system. So astrocytes, they are most abundant cells of neuroglia cells. Their job is to regulate neurotransmitters, control ionic movements. We adjust the blood flow in the capillaries of the brain. Microglia cells are least abundant cells. They are small, and their function is for phagocytosis. Ependymal cells, they are lining the central cavities of the brain and spinal cord, and their job is to secrete cerebrospinal fluid. In the central nervous system, we have oligodendrocytes, which is wrapping around the axons to produce myelin. But for the same function in the peripheral nervous system will be done by the Schwann cells. Satellite cells, they are in the peripheral nervous system. They will be present in the ganglia. Ganglia, as you saw from the previous slide, they are dorsal root ganglia, which is the accumulation of neuron cell bodies. These satellite cells surround the neuron cell bodies in the ganglia. So I want you to remember 4 neuroglia cells in the central nervous system and 2 neuroglia cells in the peripheral nervous system. So astrocytes, microglia cells, ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes will not be present in the peripheral nervous system. Let's look at them. Let's look at the shape of these neuroglia cells. Like this is astrocyte, which looks pretty similar to the neuron cell body. And if you look at that, the neuroastrocytes, they will extend to the neurons. They will extend to the blood capillaries. They will surround the capillaries, and therefore they plays a role in controlling of the blood flow in the neuron. If you look at the microglia cells, which are small little cells, least amount, but their job is for the phagocytic function. And ependymal cells, they are present in the cavities inside the central nervous system, which we call the ventricles and the central canal of the spinal cord. Their job is to produce cerebrospinal fluid. And oligodendrocytes, oligo mean few, dendro mean dendrites, these little few dendrites in these cells, as you can see here, oligodendrocytes, they are surrounding the axons in the central nervous system. The cells which surround the axon in the peripheral nervous system will be called satellite cells and Schwann cells. Of course, satellite cell is more for the ganglia. Here you can see the satellite cells surrounding the cell body of the neurons. And Schwann cell, they are covering the axon of the, they are covering the axon. More closer look at astrocytes. As you can see, astrocytes which are extending to the blood vessels, capillaries in the brain so that they can control, and they are also very closely related to the neurons, and therefore they regulate the homeostasis of the nervous system. Astrocytes star shape, they are most abundant. They regulate neurotransmitter level in the brain. They control the ionic environment. They maintain they change the blood flow in the capillaries of the brain. And they produce brain-derived tropic factors. And this is the microglia cells. Microglia cells, they are least abundant, they are smallest, their job is for phagocytic function. They will migrate and engulf, and they derive from the blood cells, which is monocyte. Ependymal cells, they line the ventricles in the brain and central canal in the spinal cord. Their job is to produce cerebrospinal fluid. Their epithelium is simple epithelium, only one layer. And this is to produce CSF, and cilia have the CSF to circulate. Oligodendrocyte, oligo, few, dendrite, dendro mean few dendrites in cells. Yes, they have some dendrites, they will connect each other, but very few. They will protect the axons. You can see the yellow axons running in the center. Of course, oligodendrocyte here, they will produce myelin, and myelin is leaving a little gap in between the one myelin sheet and another myelin sheet, and therefore it is forming myelin sheet gap. In the peripheral nervous system, we have satellite cells, which is covering or surrounding or supporting the cell body of a neuron. And we have the Schwann cell, which forms the myelin sheet covering the axon. And again, like these Schwann cells, they are interrupted from one to another, and therefore it forms the gap in between Schwann cells. What is myelin sheath? Myelin sheath is formed by the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, and it is formed by the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. It is made of just lipoprotein. It surrounds an axon for protection, insulation, prevent leakage of the electrical impulse, and increase the speed of impulse propagation and make it more efficient. If you look at the myelin protection in the peripheral nervous system, as I said, we have two types, myelinated axon fibers and non-myelinated axon fibers. In the myelinated axon fibers. As you can see, the myelin sheet covers and they wrap and wrap and wrap again and again like an onion skin. Non-myelinated axon fibers, if you look at multiple axon here, there will be only one Schwann cell surrounding, and that is very different from myelinated axon fiber. In myelinated axon fiber, one axon fiber is surrounded by multiple layers of myelin sheath. Now we are getting to the end of this lecture. Myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system, multiple concentric layers of Schwann cell membrane, as you saw it on the previous slide. They are tightly packed and they create a node of Ranvier. That's a gap in between one myelin sheath and another myelin sheath along the axon. Nerve impulse, they do not travel along the myelin sheath. They do not travel along the axon, which is covered by myelin. Instead, they jump from one myelin gap to another myelin gap. Because of this movement, the speed of conduction, electrical conduction is increased. If you look at here, this is along the axon, which is covered with myelin, and electrical impulse jump from one gap to another gap, another gap to another gap, another gap to another gap, instead of just traveling along here. This increased the efficiency of electrical conductivity in the peripheral nerve. And now I want you to look at the cross-section of the spinal cord. You can see the gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is in the center, which is an A shape. In the center of the gray matter, we have a central canal where we have our cerebrospinal fluid running. And if you look at the gray matter, of course, they are gray color because they have many cell bodies of neurons and motor neurons present. Therefore, their color is darker. And this is anterior horn. This is anterior horn. This is posterior horn. And this is posterior horn. And we can see the motor neuron leaving from the anterior horn along the, and this is what we call motor afferent fiber and leaf. And the sensory nerve, which is sensory motor fiber, sensory nerve fibers coming in, and they form the dorsal ganglia, and they leave again, and they will be carried to the spinal cord at the posterior horn. There might be interneuron, which is for the transfer of information from sensory to motor, and therefore this is called interneuron. Combination of motor and sensory, it is called a spinal nerve. Now we are looking at a cross-section of a nerve. In cross-section of a nerve, as you see, axon, start with axon here, which is part of the neuron, which is covered with the myelin sheath. And this axon and myelin sheath is covered with the layer of connective tissue, which is called endoneurium. And these multiple endoneurium covers axons. They are surrounded by the perineurium. And this perineurium cover structure is called fascicle. Multiple fascicles together with the blood vessels surrounded by the epineurium. This epineurium cover structure is called the nerve, which we see with our naked eyes. And now we are trying to conclude and close our lecture. So start from the scheme. There will be a stimulus which comes to the skin. This will be somatic sensory afferent, because it is from this body, skin, sensation carried to the body, central nervous system, and somatic sensory afferent, it is coming to the central nervous system, and it might transfer to the interneural and central nervous system, which is the spinal cord, which will be acting as an integration center. And from the anterior horn cell, a motor neuron come out, and it will go to the effector organ, which is the muscle. And therefore, if you look at that, let's say if we are touching a little fire or a small little spiky sharp point, the sensory receptor will pick up the stimuli, sharp stimuli, will be carried along the sensory neuron or afferent neuron, will be relayed in the dorsal root ganglia, and will be taken into the posterior horn of the spinal cord. And there will be interneuron there, and which certainly stimulate and act on the motor neuron, which leave the anterior horn, and we go to the appropriate muscle to contract, so that this finger, which is in pain or sharp touch, will be away from the body. But on the other hand, this is what we call the polysynaptic reflex, because it has got sensory neuron, motor neuron, in between we have the interneuron. But here, in monosynaptic reflex, now we are tapping the tendon, patellar tendon, and because there is a sudden stretch in the tendon, that information will be taken from the sensory or afferent neuron. It will travel, enter the posterior horn, go directly act on the motor neuron, and this quadricep muscle will contract suddenly. And if you look at this, there is no interneuron, and therefore stretch reflex is a monosynaptic reflex. Type of motor neurons in the sinus, just have a look. But what is more important is here, and now the finger is going to touch fire, the heat, sensory, go directly to the posterior horn with the interneuron, and the motor neuron get activated, and these motor fibers will contract and pull the hand away from the fire. This reflex is just happening at the spinal cord level. It's just touch the fire, the finger will withdraw. That is what we call withdrawal reflex. It happens at the spinal cord level. But at the same time, this sensory neuron will go along the sensory tract, and all the sensory information will be taken into the thalamus and then go to the central cortex. Now we have a memory saying that the fire is hot. So these two things happening at the same time, and now we have the sensory memory saying that this fire is hot. So that is the cortical pathway, which is slower, and intentionally we might think about taking the finger away from the fire. But at the spinal cord reflex level, the hand has been withdrawn from the damaging point already. I'm going to stop here. We are going to repeat this again and again as we go along the semester. And we have lab activities to make it clear.